bring in pro-Palestinian Jewish Australian journalist and author Antony Loewenstein. Antony, thanks so much for your time. Before we get to Trump's announcement yesterday, can I ask you about these new hate speech laws in New South Wales and also what we saw at a federal level last night? The Labor government seemingly capitulating to what the coalition has been talking about for some time, and that is mandatory sentencing. Are these two things that, I feel like the Jewish community has been calling on these measures to be implemented for quite some time. Is that going to take a bit of the fear that has been running through these communities out?
Hi, Laura. Thanks for having me. Look, when you say the Jewish community, let's be very clear what you mean by that. You're talking about the most vociferous pro-Israel elements of the Jewish community who are blindly pro-Israel, who've been calling the minimum sentences and, frankly, far more jail time. Look, there's not much evidence historically that such things actually stop these kinds of crimes. We don't really know, even now, weeks and months after a lot of these anti-Semitic attacks happened, who exactly was doing them, why. Some of them obviously were anti-Semitic. Firebombing a synagogue is undeniably anti-Semitic. Anti-Israel graffiti, to me, is not anti-Semitic. And I think mandatory minimum sentences has been criticised by a number of groups, including the one I'm involved with, the Jewish Council of Australia, because we're concerned that actually doesn't address the key issue. You essentially are arguing, not you, but the advocates of this bill, are arguing somehow that putting people in jail will be a deterrent effect. This has not been the case historically in any country to simply stop it. Now, hate speech is a problem, for sure, but I also would question, how are we defining hate speech? Who exactly is defining that? If one says, as people often do, I don't believe in Israel as a Jewish state, I'm deeply critical of Israel committing genocide, is that seen as hate speech? Some in the Jewish community would say that should be illegal. Now, I feel deeply, deeply uncomfortable. That is not hurting anybody. It's not advocating violence if one makes those kinds of comments. So I'm worried that there is a push by some in the Labor Party, many in the establishment Jewish community and some in the coalition to push for these kinds of draconian laws that actually are more about trying to curtail or silence legitimate free speech. And there is a balance between that and hate speech directed at particularly minority communities, Jewish, Muslim, etc.
When you say the establishment Jewish community, and every time I talk to you, there is a big reaction from large sections of the Jewish community. So when you come on my program, Antony, it always seems like that these views do seem to be in a very small minority. Now, I'm not delegitimizing them, but what is going on? Because there is this fear within the Jewish community at the moment. What are you trying to achieve?
I'm not denying that there is fear amongst elements of the Jewish community, seeing childcare centres, synagogues daubed. I'm not minimising the major effect that can have on Jews, particularly because of our history in Europe and elsewhere. I'm not denying any of that. What I'm saying is that many of the most vociferous pro-Israel, pro-occupation groups are unelected. No one voted for them. They represent a view. I'm not denying that some Jews in the community have a view which is like this, but many do not. Like in the US, the most hardline pro-Israel views of a group like AIPAC in the US or AJAC here in Australia, these are unelected. No one voted for them. So who gives them the right to speak for the Jewish community? No one gives them the right. They can be heard. I'm not trying to silence them. But groups like the Jewish Council, we don't claim that we represent all Jews in Australia, but there is a legitimate criticism amongst many in the Jewish community of Jewish groups that are only seeing the concept of trying to ban public protest, legitimate public protest as one example.
Don't you see that as them trying to protect themselves and their family at this time? I mean, I live in Bondi, full disclosure, and the anxieties can be palpable at times.
I'm not denying the anxiety.
Members of the Jewish community. I'm just wondering, because you put your head above the parapet, but I'm just wondering why? What is it that you're trying to achieve? Is it what you say, trying to protect free speech? Or do you legitimately believe that perhaps you represent a bigger, silent group of the Jewish community than we're led to believe?
I believe in free speech. I don't think free speech is absolute. I think certainly there are hate speech which is utterly unacceptable, whether it's directed at anyone, Christian, Muslims, Jews, whoever it may be. What I've been saying on this issue for over 20 years is the Jewish community cannot be defined by the most hardline, anti-Palestinian virulently racist views, which are
who's
actually...
hardline and who's racist? Do you think that's...
Well, I think I would argue that many of the most prominent pro-Israel groups in the country, like in the US and Europe and the UK, only see Palestinians as unacceptable. I mean, you have in the last 24 hours, Laura, when Trump and Netanyahu
Sorry, Anthony, can I just pick that up? Because it's a big claim to call them, racist in particular. I mean, I speak to men like Alex Rivkin on this program all the time. He is, and I always check in with him. I say, is criticism of Israel anti-Semitism? He agrees that it's not. He agrees that those difficult conversations need to be had. Do you see that as hardline?
But Laura, they're not being had in those spaces. What I'm saying to you is that so many, particularly younger Jews, reach out to me, the Jewish Council and others. It may be a minority. I'm not claiming there's 99% of Jews in Australia that share my view. I'm not saying that. There's a sizable minority and a growing minority that say that there is no so-called acceptable space in mainstream Jewish spaces to have these conversations. Now, the Jewish pro-Israel lobby can say, yes, we think it's acceptable to have those conversations. They're not allowing them. They're literally demonising, silencing, bullying media organisations who platform those voices. That is the reality, publicly and privately.
Well, but, if we're not listening to we're giving everyone a platform, are we not? Are you saying that those...
You mean Sky News, or you just mean the media in general?
Well, I'm talking about... Let me talk about my program, because I'm qualified to talk about that.
Sure.
Give voices to everyone. So,
well, I welcome that.
I mean,
and thank you for that.
You're talking about free speech. Are you saying that I shouldn't have some of these people on my program to talk about these issues that affect them daily?
I did not say that. What I'm saying is that there are a lot of these very prominent so-called pro-Israel groups, AJAC, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, and others, are deeply intolerant of critical views towards Israel and are pushing an agenda which is pro-annexation, I would argue, genocide in Gaza. Now, people will find that controversial and outrageous. When you have a Jewish establishment that says nothing critical of an Israeli government, of Israeli military policies, that basically are a mouthpiece for an Israeli government, a leader of Israel that is wanted on calls of war crimes by the International Court of Justice. International Criminal Court. What exactly are we saying? Who is speaking for the Jewish community? Those views, I'm not trying to silence them. I'm not trying to say they aren't allowed to be heard. We live in a free democracy. But those groups are regularly bullying media outlets, Laura, when critical views are on. I know this because I'm told about it constantly. So when they say, yes, we're open to free speech and a robust debate of views, it's nonsense. They're not, because they try to silence critical voices, especially Jewish and Palestinian ones. Now, your show, I'm not being critical of your show. Putting your show aside, I'm saying in general, where it's directed at the ABC or 9 newspapers, all parts of the Murdoch press, there is a deep antipathy to views that are in any way sympathetic to Palestinians. And to me, as someone Jewish, that is actually endangering all of us, because non-Jews in the community see mainstream Jewish organisations bullying and trying to silence critical views, which in my view leads to actual anti-Semitism. Doesn't justify it, but it partly explains it. This has been a case for decades in Australia, in the US and elsewhere.
I've discussed with you before, both privately and publicly on this show, and I feel I need to put it to you every time. I mean, what you're saying to me today does seem to be in the vast minority of things. In terms of the feedback I get, and in terms of what many members of the Jewish community say to me personally, and the feedback we get here at Sky News.
I suppose my response to that would be, as I've often said to you, Laura, even if there was 2 Jews in Australia who opposed what was going on in Israel, as an example, the vast majority, there was a poll that came out this week supporting the forced removal of Palestinians from Gaza. That is a mainstream view in Israel, what essentially Trump and Netanyahu proposed in the last 24 hours. Now, one could argue if you're against that, you're in a minority. Sure. I'm very happy to be in a minority in that view. The idea that the majority has a certain view on Israel, Palestine, war crimes, occupation, which is deemed to be the voices that we hear in the media, Sky News, Murdoch Press, Nine, wherever it may be, doesn't make those views okay. They can be challenged. They need to be challenged. And I feel it's important for the wider community to hear critical Jewish voices on these issues, on anti-Semitism, on how to fight it, on what's happening in Palestine, on occupation, on genocide in Gaza. That is vital to have those voices. And I think that much of the media is often, I'm not talking about you, Laura, but many media is scared.
And I'm not taking it personally, don't worry.
But many media is scared to have critical Jewish...
We're not seeing Muslim childcare centres burned to the ground. We're not seeing mosques firebombed. And I think that is a very critical point that we need to remember in this conversation, right?
And as I said, there has been an undeniable increase in totally unacceptable and racist anti-Semitic violence. We don't still really know, as all viewers will know, where this is coming from, why, who is doing it. I know the government recently suggested it was maybe outside forces paying criminal groups here. We don't know. Regardless of that, of course it's unacceptable. And I understand that many, many Jewish people feel scared. As I might add, Laura, there has been attacks on mosques over the years, many attacks. But there's no doubt that attacks on Jews...
They're not equitable now, though, are they?
No, right now what's happening to the parts of the Jewish community is utterly unacceptable. I have said that from day one. The Jewish Council said that. What we're saying, though, is that how the Albanese government, the coalition Dutton potential government, and much of the Jewish establishment is making this problem worse.
But you've waded not you personally, but the Jewish Council has waded into the political, ultra-critical of Peter Dutton in a media statement just a couple of days ago. And it seems that they are picking sides. They haven't been critical of the Albanese government.
Well, I've been very critical of the appointment of the anti-Semitism envoy, Gillian Siegel, who obviously was appointed by Albanese, I think it was last year.
What, you don't think it's necessary?
To what? To have an anti-Semitism envoy?
Yeah.
I'm not saying it. Well, I think it's pretty problematic to appoint an anti-Semitism envoy that essentially is a pro-Israel zealot. Yes, I do think that is a problem.
What's wrong with that?
What's wrong with it is that you are unable...
Anti-Semitism is on the rise. You're not going to appoint an anti-Israel envoy, though, are you?
I'm suggesting that you appoint as an Albanese government someone that is so clearly associated and pushing, not just for censorship of critical voices towards Israel, has been deeply critical of Palestinian self-determination. So I think it's deeply inappropriate. Now, is the Jewish Council going after Peter Dutton? Well, firstly,
yes,
the Jewish Council doesn't have one view on everything, but I think it's legitimate to say if the alternative Prime Minister, could be Prime Minister within 2 or 3 months, has a long history of demonising minorities and Muslims and others. And I think it's legitimate to say that in many, many cases, politicians like him are using elements of the Jewish community to prove his so-called pro-Israel bona fides. And we reject that 110%. Even if he is the alternative Prime Minister in 3 months, so be it. It's our responsibility and our right to do so in a democracy.
Actually, I've got to leave it there. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Laura.
Well, Maori